Good evening. Am I okay? Can you hear me all right? So this is March 1st, huh? And there's a full moon, I think. So that's always a good sign. It's St. David's Day for the Welsh among you. I'm Stephen Yenser from the English department at UCLA, who's one of the sponsors of the Hammer series. Others include the Friends of English and the university's Office of Cultural and Recreational Affairs, as well as this little jewel box of a museum, which I learned just the other day, as probably some of you did too. It's going to expand. They've gotten a terrific grant and millions and millions of dollars, and so I guess it's going to go from a jewel box to a treasure chest in the next couple of years. Yeah. Rosanna Warren, who is a recipient essayist and a translator and an editor and a scholar, as well as a poet, is steeped in the classics and in French and Italian literature and art. So her world is a large one. And one of her recent poems even flies an epigraph from Coco Chanel, which I had not expected. A garment should be logical, Coco tells us. Reading that poem of Rosanna's not long ago, I thought of a favorite Chanel maxim of my own: take off the last thing you put on. It's sage advice, I think, and so inevitably it has taken other forms, including the words of Robert Browning's perfect painter, Andrea del Sarto, less is more. That's a word to the wise, but it won't, I think, nullify Blake's equally famous and seemingly contrary proverb, exuberance is beauty. Or that's what I was thinking to myself. Then I realized that I was thinking that to myself because one of the things that I love about Rosanna's work is her attention at once to exuberance and to economy. One can see these enthusiasms converging everywhere in her work, starting with her fondness for particulars. She dotes on details, so they spring up in little catalogs, often enough of flora, autumn olive, blackthorn, forsythia, dogwood, so on. And thus the allure of more, but they also testify, these catalogs, to the power of less, since what she will have no truck with is the vague generalization. And after all, the abundance of nature, to commit one such generalization, would be no more accurate a locution than, say, the waste of nature. In another of her many catalogs, this time one of refuse, her young speaker drops, I'm quoting, a paperback spiritual guide to self-transformation in the trash with onion peels, melon rinds, tea bags, fish bones, and holiday photos of impeccable children. Isn't that lovely? What a list. Fish bones and holiday photos of impeccable children. How much of our hunger for accomplishment on the one hand and our miserable limitations on the other are there in that little list. My point is that her careful details obviate empty cliches, or at least that's one point. Another is that, as she says admiringly of a deceased friend, she is never not one to look at things squarely. Having been a painter, she has a painterly eye, so we are treated to vivid images like this. Early morning, as the plane tilts, slathers a heat haze film of talcum powder and buttermilk over the sea. But because she's a superb poet, as sensitive to the awful as she is to the cheerful, she's ever alert to the world's relics and indigestibles. For example, coyote scat, small bear tracks, and the gray, dry stogie of an owl pellet. Coughed up, burlap textured, prickly, with bits of hair and bone. As a young woman, she tells us at one point she looked obsessively for the hole in everything. That's H-O-L-E, the hole in everything. But now she emulates Whitman, who saw things whole, W-H-O-L-E, and discovers in her dead friend's study, along with his neatly stacked manuscripts and photos of his loved ones, the small, dried body of a mouse, perhaps a private message from that good gray poet himself. Like that owl pellet, it is just as lovingly rendered as the pastoral landscape in another poem of hers where, I'm quoting, "In the meadow, sweet William vied with daylilies, foxglove, and tall, tufted weeds, and clumps of mist dragged jellyfish tendrils across the lake." What a range, huh? Rosanna Warren.
Stephen, thank you for that remarkably generous and observant introduction. And I have to say it's eerie because we didn't consult at all about what Stephen was going to say, but he was quoting a lot from the poem I had planned to read first, which is called A Cosmos, spelled with a K, for Walt Whitman. And so I will start with that poem. Stephen's already read you about half of it. It is part of us. I plan to read a few poems from this recent book, Ghost in a Red Hat, but mostly from new poems from a manuscript I think I'll be calling Graffiti. But in the Ghost in a Red Hat, there are some poems which are elegies for my friend Deborah Tall, the writer, and this Cosmos poem, this Whitman poem, is one of those. So here it is. A Cosmos. You lay in your last sleep, not sleep, head tilted stiffly to the right on the pillow, at a sharper angle than when you bent over poems year after year, and we plucked at each other's lines, as if you now considered some even starker question. Your IV tubes were gone. Your arms were bruised. A blue cloth cap enfolded your pale, bald head. It was too late to give you the lavender shawl I'd imagined more for my sake than for yours. Your mouth was suddenly tender, the mouth of a girl. You had come very far to come here. Never one not to look at things squarely. Now you looked inward. Who knows what you saw? And when, weeks later, we gathered again at the house to say those formal farewells, I went up to your study looking for leaves of grass and found, instead, your orderly desk unused, your manuscripts neatly stacked, the framed photographs of your girls, and like a private message from Whitman, who saw things whole, the small, dried body of a mouse. A cosmos, he too. He too, luckier. This book, the Ghost book, has a kind of wild variety of tones, so I'm going to inflict a few of these different tones upon you. I have, in the course of some years, invented an alter ego, a French poet called Anne Vervaine, and she does all kinds of things that I never did or wouldn't do, and has ideas I don't have, and she sort of took off on her own. She eventually got to be a little threatening to me. Editors seemed to like her more than they liked me. So I arranged to have her kidnapped and is presumed dead in Uzbekistan. That was some years ago. But I translate her poems, which she left conveniently with her sister in Paris. This is Anne Vervaine 7 from the notebooks of Anne Vervaine. Distance was the house in which I welcomed you, but it was in the river that we became cadence, there where the current braided together again after the stone bridge stanchion parted the stream. It was to last only as long as the beauty lasted. Do you believe in the soul? Words torn from the void, wet and mewling. Where we walked on the mountain, water poured around us, surged up from springs, seethed down in rivulets, rocky streams, and one long, blinding cascade. Your kisses were an eau de vie, and as bitter. I am poured out like water. Distance is feminine in French. I held a knife to a man's throat and let him bleed quietly into a cup. What does us mean? Coiled serpentine headdress of Leonardo's woman. You wanted her. I wanted you. Chill sunlight flexing itself on the city river gave me the emptiness I needed to write these instructions. Sorrow is a liqueur. Drink deep. We will all be consumed. An Italian poet was translating some of my poems some years ago, and he translated one poem I won't read tonight, but it was a pretty harsh poem, and he made it pretty because he couldn't bear the idea of this image of the woman in the poem not being having a bella figura. And I protested, and I said, no, this is meant to be ugly. And he said, no, I can't do that. And I insisted. So here's one of my ugly poems. And I hasten to say it's not autobiographical. Ocular. So damp, the pages of novels curl up like vine leaves. The stories smear. In the metro this morning, a man was scraping a poster from the wall. All the promised felicity hung in shreds. My eye is swollen, purple. I can't read, near or far. My childhood is far. I slept on a naked mattress the pit bull ripped. It reeked of smoke. Needles littered the floor. I starved myself. I admired my delicate ribs, the leaves of a petrified prehistoric fern. I was prehistoric. My eye teeth turned to fangs. Day marched in, carrying night on his shoulders, a wizened old man. I preferred night. Come to me, I said. I'll kiss you anyway. Even if you're ancient and I'm blind and bruised. We'll laugh. We'll be the book of Revelation. I'll wear lingerie from the crypt and we'll eat at the Loveless Cafe where biscuits steam and no one spits in the jam. That was years ago. Night's tired now. We've worn each other out. We hardly meet. But I still have one good eye. And when I squint, You wouldn't believe what I see. There really is a Loveless Cafe in Nashville, which I patronized years ago. And it was carefully explained to me by the locals that it didn't really mean without love. It was from a distortion of the Old English name Lovelace. But nevertheless, it was a shabby shack with good biscuits on the outskirts of town, which had some other attached shacks, which were apparently very useful for local adulteries. So I thought the Loveless Cafe was just enchanting as a name. Okay. Man in stream. You stand in the brook, mud smearing your forearms, a bloodied mosquito on your brow, your yellow t-shirt dampened to your chest as the current flees between your legs, amber verdigris, unraveling today's story, last night's travail. You stare at the father beaver, eye to eye, but he outstares you, who trespass in his world, who have, however unwilling, yanked out his fort, stick by tooth-gnarled, mud-clabbered stick, though you whistle vespers to the wood thrush and trace flame flicker in the grain of yellow birch. Death outpaces us. Upended roots of fallen trees still cling to moss-furred granite. Lichen smolders on wood rot. Fungus trails in wisps. I wanted a day with cracks to let the godlight in. The forest is always a nocturne, but it gleams. The birch tree tosses its change from palm to palm. And we who unmake are ourselves unmade, if we know, if only we know, how to give ourselves in this untendered light. I suppose it doesn't really matter, but I spent part of my childhood in France, and some of these poems are placed in France. This one is the town of Montpellier in the south of France. Not a pretty France, not a tourist France. It's a pretty tough place. Intermezzo, piano solo. Those teasing notes descending reverse themselves. The whole piece mirrors itself upside and down. Your fingers find their way, moving by heart, sotto voce, from one thicket to another, registering dolente in the soft tissue of fingerprints. What a poverty of notes, how richly strung. As your kisses, perdendosi, repeat themselves from 1 hour, 1 day to the next, but never the same. And now that you're gone, diminuendo, the andante strays imperfectly in my mind. The nights are long, meridional, raucous. I see now, purity was just an effect of inexperience. In the street below, the kids, crescendo, curse till dawn, practice fellatio by streetlight, pressed to the wall. Yeah, I did have to persuade my Italian translator that I wasn't writing pretty poems. Oranges. Sleeping on the balcony floor in Crete one night, I woke to see the silhouette of the roof slide over and mask the one glass glint star. The stone house shuddered. The balcony twitched under my sleeping bag like a horse gathering to buck its rider. But the roof shimmied back into place and revealed the star. A clay tile fell, Then quiet. Unlike the story a prisoner told once about the hole in his poem, it was in a bar. 1 minute he was standing there, and the next he was on the floor bleeding, which was everything his poem hadn't said. The other man died. That season in Crete, I was looking for the hole in everything I knew. I'd rise at dawn, pack Augustine's Confessions and oranges, take the bus out of town to hike the high pastures and goat paths, and sleep on the ground to the tolling of sheep bells. I thought the stars would tell me a truth. The stones were hard under my back. A sheep tiptoed up and breathed on my face. I had nothing yet to confess. God was a large idea and awfully far. By dawn, the stars had paled, and I woke, stiff, hungry, and elated, and hiked 8 hours down the gorge into a story I did not yet know. And so now I'll read you some of the pieces from graffiti. Let's see. Shelf. A human skull among the bibelots. Dust to dust, it all evens out on the shelf under a veil of gray. There was a think in that cavity once. I have forgotten whole years of my life. In those eye sockets once surprise and fear. You picked it up in a field in Turkey, a small head, a child, a youth. Who knows how he, she died? Though we can imagine, yes, horribly imagine, and so forget. Better look at the Kenyan statuette of a woman carrying a pot on her head, or the soapstone dove from Japan, or twisted driftwood. Why go looking for sorrow? Yet we look, we hunt. You probe the boiled mackerel head for every mite of sustenance, brain, the tiny white golf balls of eyes, the fatty ribbon along the jaw, an augury in each bite. I don't want to remember how much pain I've caused. Centuries of war we store in our craniums. But in that skull, now crouched on the shelf, no echo, no prayer, only air, a relic of air. Rats. As if you rose out of your coffin, as if my heart was your coffin. You rose yesterday in the turquoise faceted light of syringes, hospital sheets, and toxic Niagara mist you painted into a glossy forever. I felt again your weight upon me, that Manhattan night in our quasi-childhood. You moved lovelessly upon me, almost angry. Anger I almost allowed myself to know. As we lay on a borrowed floor, trying to make what might be called love, you broke each spell. The way Proust discovered love in captured rats squealing as the hatpin probed their vital organs. I was a slow student. I learned dumbly, blindly, and graduated to my own destructions. The white rats scamper through your landscapes of pill bottles and blood, chopped trees and massacred Adirondack deer. And I dream of knocking all the books off my shelf so that in the light breaking from those pages, I might behold, not hold, your broken face. In this new collection, I'm making a series of poems. I've stolen a title from Chaucer. It's called A Legend of Good Women, and most of my women are really not good. One of them is Coco Chanel. So I'll read a few of these women. This one's a new poem that I think is going to be sent around on the Academy of American Poets, whatever they send out, these spitballs of poems. Fugue, harpsichord, for Sylvia Marlowe. Some of you who care about music may remember that Sylvia Marlowe was about, a generation ago, one of the really great harpsichordists of her generation, along with Ralph Kirkpatrick. Fugue, harpsichord. Out of her left hand fled the stream. From her right, the rain puckered the surface. Drop by drop, the current splayed in a downward daze until it hit the waterfall, churned twigs and leaves, smashed foam over stone. From her fingers slid eddies, bubbles rose. The fugue heaved up against itself, against its own falling, digressed in curlicues under shadowed banks, around root tangles and beaver-gnawed sticks. She had the face of a pike, the thrusting lower jaw and silvered eye, pure drive. The form fulfilled itself through widowhood, her skin mottled with shingles, hands crooked, a pain. I fled. Now that tempered tumult moves my time into her timing, far beyond her dying, my tinnitus. I am still through the thrum of voices, trying to hear. Another one of the women in my legend is the painter I enormously admire, Gwen John. Her brother Augustus John in early 20th century was the famous one, but I think Gwen John is the really great painter. And she was both a model and a lover. She lived in Paris, though she was English, and she was the model and the lover of Rodin for some years. And this poem is called Rodin Commands, and the scene is set. Gwen John and Hilda Flodin, his assistant, make love for his viewing. Rodin commands. When you will do the unthinkable because the other wills it, as peony petals droop and cringe, and the whole blossom crumples sidewise, open to fingers coaxing it apart, we could call this a loss of form, a velvet shivering. She, upon his instruction, lies down with Hilda, taking leave of her own body, for truly, whose are those limbs entwined, and whose the convulsion trilling down even to stiffening toes? It's his brush that arcs, his aquarelle pleasuring these collapsible blooms. The paper drips and runs, small flames shudder in the coal stove. The bouquet sags. His greatest gift will have been to prove, once and for all, that the person craving is not. Here's one more of my gals. Chanel, when I was this sort of series just sort of grown organically, and I thought of them as remarkable women, and then I found myself correcting myself to myself in my little inner dialogue. Some of them remarkably awful, and I think Coco Chanel qualifies as remarkably awful, though what a great artist. That's not an excuse. Chanel, a garment should be logical. Coco Chanel. Yes, I made the perfume. Yes, I am an orphan. Light my cigarette. Just so. The perfect profile intaglioed in air. Now let the hems down. Now we slash the collar. And when a man enters, always make him pay. Always a stray prince around before the casino closes. This century tilts. I'm good at sphinxing. Elegance excludes. I exclude milk, waste, tears, uterus. Do I remember the lard-colored orphanage halls? No, I refuse. Place a Coromandel screen in front of the car wreck and your world war. My demi-monde. We live in an age with no interiors, and his blood scrawled the pavement by the crumpled car. Embellishment gives way to line and ease of motion. A Bugatti flair, wealth assuming the proportion of catastrophe. And if the other was a German officer, I'm on my knees with a corona of pins bristling from my lips. It's not adoration, it's revenge. And to change the tone, which I like to keep doing, I don't like to be too grim. This is very much changing the landscape too. You'll recognize this is very North America here. Let's leave old wrecked France behind. Dark light. The moon dragged her string net bag of shadows through the boughs as we felt our way along the night road, gravel crackling under our feet. The stream in the gully gnashed dark thoughts about the rocks, and we steered by treetops, tall spruces with their necromancer's sleeves, white pines raising arms in supplication, celebration. Who could tell? From the meadow we'd seen Cassiopeia's maternal zigzag. Hard to lose a daughter to sea monster, then to bridegroom, but all that family sorrow now twinkles quietly in the enormous sky. Everyone in place, father, mother, daughter, reaching starry arms to hero husband. Here on earth, the mother bear at twilight heaved a rock over with a single shove and scooped carefully for grubs while the pointy-nosed cub sat on its haunches. Coal black, the bears, and the mountain laurel in bloom lay like a drift of summer snow. I mean, I like to caution that a lot of my poems might feel autobiographical, but often aren't, or they're only partially so. But this bear thing really happened in a cabin in the Catskills. I was all by myself and writing in the summer, and the door to my writing room was open to the little porch, and all of a sudden there was this huge black mother bear and her cub together right by the porch, flipping over this rock and eating grubs. They were about 15 feet from me. And I sat there completely paralyzed, watching through the window and thinking, do I have the courage to get up, walk to the door, and close it? Because that will bring me 10 feet from a mother bear and her cub. So eventually I motivated myself and got up and got to the door and closed it. And they were so fixed on the grubs, they just sort of looked at me and then went back to eating their grubs. But it was, I felt this is a visitation. Here's some more North America. The line. It's hard to see them through the lacing of forest shadows, the old crimson blazes on tree trunks marking the line. Sometimes the tree has fallen. Sometimes the paint has worn away and could be confused with lichen. I clamber down banks, trample underbrush, pause squinting through boughs, seeking the next mark. The pines have scaly, lacerated bark. Yellow birches wring crabbed hands and shudder. I played here as a child. Now I stumble from boulder to moss hollow. Who was that girl in raggedy summer jeans and smudged t-shirt, scrambling up granite ledges? I think I see her slip like a coyote into older dark. She had unevenly cropped hair, grime in her fingernails. She crouched on a rock midstream and peered for trout, umber quaver in the bronze-flecked flow. And once, in shadow, kissed another girl on the mouth, both of them wanting to know how a boy's kiss would taste. It tasted of fear, moist, tremulous, hovering on a brink of territory imagined but unmarked, whose wind came muttering through branches, smelling of balsam and leaf mold, of creatures loosened back into the ground. Let's see. I think I'm coming to the conclusion here. The mink. You can see I like animals. The mink. When the mink ran across the meadow in bunched black parabolas, I thought sine and cosine, but no, the movement never dips below the line. The creature vanished into barberries, absolute predator who cracks a rabbit's spine in one bite, and my mind leapt along a track to a summer field where I walked years ago, to a stony spit out into the North Atlantic with a young man I hardly knew and his sister. He was bald, dying of a brain tumor. I ignored his illness, and we spoke of history. He was gentle, scholarly. Why do I remember him when it was his sister I painted seated in tall grass, her forehead wide, brown hair framing her face, ocean a cobalt swatch behind, islands humped in little arcs across the bay. That canvas is stacked in a closet, but it's the dead boy I've stored inside me all these years, scared of the otherworldly light around his eyes, scared and ashamed of what I didn't know, ashamed of my fear that made his death, when it came, unspeakable. So history bounds into the present, glitter-eyed, with musky anal glands and daggering eye teeth, because that boy wasn't dead. He must be killed again. And I'll just read two more. This is just skipping back to France for a moment. Although this scene could happen in any post-industrial, unhappy country. July. Under the cliff wall of apartment blocks, on a narrow patch of grass as tough and discolored as old carpet, they have parked their motorbikes and distributed themselves. A tribe, a colony, girls and boys, some lounging on the sward, some on cement paving in a strip of shade, some on two facing wrought iron benches planted in concrete. Out of range of grown-ups, they play cards, they scuffle. A girl places her head on a boy's lap to practice kissing. They smoke, they pass lit cigarettes back and forth. A smaller boy pops a soccer ball against the wall with slow, heat-drugged sidewise kicks. Hours pass. Cigarettes burn down. The ball thuds and shadows lengthen across concrete from 4 cypresses and 6 anorexic ginkgos. Day is endless. Summer is endless. Their throats sweetly sear. They drink Coke and toss the plastic bottles on the grass. This place, for now, is theirs. They can throw what they want. Their lungs are their own to burn. Their limbs loll in the loosened harmony of dancers at rest. They can pick themselves up when they want. And I don't like to say much about poems, so here's the last one. Except I will say, the title is Cotillion Photo, and I never had a cotillion. I didn't even know what they were, but I saw some photos. Cotillion Photo. These young women will last forever, posed like greyhounds, trapped in the silver crust of the frame. You can't tell one from another. The breed is so pure. They will never run. Each one aloft on a frozen wave of white cotillion lace. To resemble marriage, to resemble fate. I remember July sun pouring down in a prickly meadow and a garter snake skin laid out like fairy lingerie on a stone wall. This was Connecticut. There would be a stone wall. Crickets were scraping marrow from the day. I was young. I'd been alone for weeks. I painted the meadow morning and afternoon, trying to capture the crackling sound with my brush. I was reading Oedipus Rex. I understood neither the snakeskin nor the play. Your life is one long night, said Oedipus to the prophet. Oedipus, who saw nothing. Oak trees rustled in drought. In saffron grass, small creatures skittered. There came a day when I said to myself, I should prefer to sleep. Small planets tasted dry and bitter on my tongue. And 2 days later, I woke, alone in the creaking barn at dusk, not knowing what day, what month, what year, but feeling the hall of earth rolling on its way. It is not your fate that I should be your ruin, the prophet said. I moved my arms, my legs, I unclenched my hands, and stood up, dizzy, from the cot. What was to come would come, in its own good time, outside the frame. The moon was rising above the hill, a shy wind gathered force, and trees, in their black silhouettes, linked arms. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. Splendid poems. She will sign some books outside in the, if you would like to get one, in the atrium, whatever we call that part out there. And I think there are probably cookies and coffee and tea out there too. So hang around for a few if you like. And thanks very much for coming out tonight.